Now this was a moon-sized read. Hello everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to decide. Is that worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Well, let's decide. Honestly, I'm surprised it took her that long. Normally she's up in my face before I even start. She hears that clicking. Gotta get in her face. Now, before we get into this review, I want to quickly clarify here. When I first chose out my initial TBR, I was under the impression that Rogue Squadron was a Galactic Civil War era book rather than a New Republic book. And, starting to read it, I realized my mistake. So, quickly trying to adjust, I dug through my EU shelf and found a book that took place in the Galactic Civil War era, i.e. this one. But the point is, that's why this book is coming out of nowhere compared to when I read it on my TBR. Now, I was initially going to surprise you with whatever book I felt like at the very end of the month, but I wanted to keep consistent with my theme of going from before Clone Wars, Galactic Civil War, the New Republic. Except this time you'll be getting 2 New Republic books instead of just 1. Which, to be fair, is probably for the better. The New Republic era in the EU is ultimately one of the more fascinating eras of it, whereas all the other ones are very much connected to the canon and can't do much to change the overall plot. That being said, Death Star is a Star Wars EU novel written by Michael Reaves and Steve Perry and published on October 16th, 2007. That means it was published well after the release of The Revenge of the Sith, meaning that they had the full Star Wars timeline branched out at that point. However, apart from mentioning that this was a New York Times bestseller, I really don't have much else to say about the background of this book, so here's me dropping the book. And here's the report card. Now on to the cover review. Now, the cover on this is simple but good. All you really have for this cover, at least in my version, and the version I'll be obviously critiquing, is a ship approaching a half-finished Death Star. And that's pretty much it. However, I like it because, 1, it immediately sets the timeline. You already know this is going to be taking place in the time period where the Death Star isn't quite built, but is in the almost process of being done. You know that's when the time period is going to be taking place. And since the majority of the book takes place on the Death Star, you know this is a good wing. It tells you this is what it's all about that. I mean, so does the title, to be completely fair. But this is a really simple cover, but it's very effective at doing what it wants to do and doesn't need to do anything else. So I don't really have any complaints about this cover. Good cover. My compliments to the artist. On to the next section, since I can only just sit there and praise a cover for so long before it gets repetitive. We'll go into the synopsis. Now, obviously, I didn't read this in my TBR. However, I will still suggest going to check that out to see the next 2 books coming up. But since I didn't read this in my TBR, to give a slightly more in-depth synopsis, or I say in-depth, but it's pretty much going to be the same amount as normal. This is an ensemble book. Basically, it takes a large group of characters and shows their daily lives 3 years from before the start of A New Hope all the way to the end of A New Hope on the Death Star. Now, the story is very much about life on the Death Star, but it chooses to follow a variety of Imperial-aligned characters to show what life on the Death Star was like before it went pop. Now, our cast includes a large variety of people. It includes a Twi'lek. I know there are 2 ways to say it. Twi'lek and Twi'lek. I'm just say Twi'lek because it's easier on my speech impediment, even though I like Twi'lek a little better in terms of pronunciation. But a Twi'lek bartender named Minma, her bouncer, a large man named Rodo, an Imperial sergeant known by Nova Steel who teaches Terra Psi classes, which, for my last video, I explained is basically the MMA of Star Wars. A political prisoner conscripted into becoming an architect on the Death Star named Tila, an Imperial pilot by the name of Vil Dance, the Imperial gunner who gets a job firing the main gun on the Death Star named Tan Granite, a stowaway who managed to get onto the planet from a prison planet named Atua, who's kind of part human, part plant. It's a little weird how that works. And a returning character from the MedStar series known as I'm going to look at my thing here. It's Uli Divini. We also get chapters from the perspective of both Darth Vader and Tarkin, so you have a very large cast to work with here. And honestly, that should have been obvious due to the size of this book. It's easily the biggest of the EU books I've read this year. Or this month. Well, technically this year, but that remains to be seen if it stays. But it's easily the largest EU book I've read. Since this book mostly deals with life on the Death Star and the slow build-up to it eventually being put into use, I'm going to go ahead and just move on to my review. Simply put, I loved it. Yeah, it takes a special kind of book to engage my hyper-focus to the point where I sit here for 2.5 hours just reading everything I can, even when I have my computer right here next to me and a game station all the way over there. Because normally my ADHD is like, okay, we can do 2, maybe 3 chapters at a time, but then you better do something else to briefly take your mind off it. And so when I sat here and I went from like chapter 47, no, I think it was a little bit before that, but I went from chapter 47 all the way to the end, which is like chapter 76. I read that all in one go. It was 2.5 hours I spent doing nothing but sitting in this chair, looking at this book, and because I was that transfixed. The way it weaves its own original timeline, its own original characters and story, with not only its original plot, well, not only with the already established EU, but with the actual mainstream canon, it's just really nice. It doesn't just stop when A New Hope starts. You actually see the events of A New Hope from the point of view of the characters on the Death Star. Uli has to tend to Princess Leia after she's interrogated with that, little torture bot, basically. I don't know if I can say torture on YouTube anymore. But then you also get to see Nova Steel when he watches Tarkin and Darth Vader blow up Alderaan, and you get the perspective of the gunner literally pulling the switch. Honestly, this entire cast I really enjoyed reading about. I can say for sure that aside from the ones that unfortunately don't make it to the end of the book, I honestly want to go to Wikipedia after I'm done filming this review and look up every character just to see if they make reappearances in EU novels after this one. And it was just, I really liked a majority of the characters. Some are much stronger than others, don't get me wrong, but I do think they're really good. Because namely, what this book does, above all else, is humanize the Death Star. Now, we all know there's like simple plots and stuff that's like, more accurately, it humanizes the people within the Death Star. Now we're not just seeing things from the hero's point of view where it's filled with a bunch of faceless goons who just want to kill them. We see how the inner workings work. We see them setting up bars. We see them setting up parks. We see them setting up all this to make this station not just a battle station to blow up planets, but a home for the people on here. But it also takes that time. It takes that humanization and helps explain away some of the things that people joke about when it comes to Star Wars. Like, where did those stormtroopers go that were chasing right behind Han Solo? Well, in this book, it explains that Nova Steel, who is disillusioned with the Empire, was one of the stormtroopers leading that group chasing after Han Solo. But he decides to lead his troop off in the wrong direction so he can give Han Solo time to escape. Or the famous scene, you know this one, the one that was supposed to increase tension, but was so drawn out that it ended up creating a sense of bad pacing. This one.
Stand by.
This one, the context this book gives is so much better for this scene. To explain that context, you remember Tan Granite, which I mentioned earlier as the Imperial Gunner? Well, that's him. In the movie, this character is nothing more than a faceless cog in the Imperial machine that fires the gun and blows up planets. However, the book gives him a name. It shows who he is before, how much this sounds exciting to be able to fire this gigantic gun for the Empire. It makes you really feel for this guy, especially after he commits the first planet wipe. Now, in the EU, much like the now mainline canon, the Death Star was used before at half power on a different planet. Now, in the mainline canon, this ended up becoming Scarif, where they destroyed the Imperial installation on it to try to stop the rebels. However, in this book is Despare. Despare? I don't know how to say it, but I think it's Despare, which is a prison planet where they basically conscripted most of the workers to build the Death Star from. And Tarkin, deciding to test the gun, just decimates the planet with all the criminals still on it. Now, Tangranit is able to justify this one to himself because this is like the Australia of prison planets. That's not even a joke. That's literally how it's described. Everything there wants to kill you, and only the worst criminals were thrown there until they kind of started creating their own society. So he was able to justify that to himself because, I mean, not only was everyone who lived there supposedly supposed to be there because they were a danger to the galaxy at large, but the planet itself just kind of wanted to kill anyone who landed on it. However, after he pulls the trigger on Alderaan, he's unable to justify that one to himself. And that infamous scene where he's just like, stand by, that's not him, that's not bad pacing anymore. That's a character going through a mental breakdown with trying to live with the guilt that he's done by killing billions of people and stalling as long as possible to give the rebels attacking the station as much time as he possibly can to try and do something. He knows that if he refuses to fire the gun, they'll just drag him off and immediately replace him, so he stalls. It's really nice. I liked it. So you might ask yourself, what am I rating this book? 1 out of 10. It was a wonderful book, don't get me wrong, but I can never forgive this book for making me think of this man's amorous adventures with the amount of detail it puts into it. Okay, so joking aside, I'll just use that joke as a segue into my more critical parts of the review. But, yeah, okay, so this isn't really critical, but it is one of those please stop kind of moments in the book. Because we see Tarkin was kind of a horn dog. He has this dalliance with a character named Admiral Dala, one of those two. And I'm positive this character is probably an EU legacy character, so I guarantee you she's from a different book. But they spend a lot of time in bed together. Like, every scene with them two together is like, after this chapter ends, we'll go into my private quarters. And I'm just like, stop it. I don't want to think of this man in that way, please. But more actual critical reviews of this was, there are a couple plot lines in this book that were unnecessary or kind of felt like they were here just to pad out. One of which is Nova Steel, I keep calling him Steel, is a Force-sensitive character. And while this is interesting in its own right, an Imperial Sergeant being Force-sensitive while serving on the Death Star, in close proximity to Vader, should be a perfect thing for tension. However, it doesn't really affect anything, to be completely honest with you. There was at no point where him being Force-sensitive was actually really relevant to the plot. I guess is a good way of saying it. I mean, I guess it is more of a character study. It's a minor complaint overall, just to put this out there. But him being Force-sensitive is just kind of there. I guess it helps explain his turn against the Empire later on, because he every time they blow up a planet, he's immediately hit with all the pain of those billions of people dead. But it's one of those, it doesn't, I don't see the reason he needed to be Force sensitive. To be more critical on the Tarkin subplot, it doesn't, while it is nice that it tries to humanize Tarkin, even though I kind of feel he was best when he isn't humanized, it does feel like most of his scenes are more around Admiral Dala and setting her up or explaining the reason she acts the way she does in other works. That's why I'm positive she shows up later. It's just the way the story is structured around him. It just doesn't make much sense unless you take into mind that she will be in a different book. Especially since the book itself references something I know is from the EU called the Sun Crusher. In addition, I think there's just a tiny bit too many characters. I think the story could have been better off snipping off one or two, at most three, because at a certain point it starts to get a little hard to keep track of them all. During the early parts of the book, I was actually confusing Bill Dance with Tan Granite. because both are Imperial soldiers that desperately want to be on the Death Star and are considered aces at what they do, and their motivations of why they eventually turn against the Empire, more or less, feels exactly the same. It's one of those, I also thought the librarian was slightly pointless. There's a character librarian that pops up, and while he does justify his plot a little more, actually referencing the Dark Forces EU video game, that was interesting. He kind of feels like an easy fix character. Instead of having his own plot line that feels justified, he feels more like he was put in to help the other characters fulfill their plot lines, which I guess is fine. I would have liked more from him personally to justify why he was there. Honestly, all of what I've just said are nitpicks at best, and personally, I got nothing else to say about this book, so my final rating is an 8 out of 10. Yeah, this book is really good. I was actually honestly surprised. I saw its rather hefty bulk compared to the others, and I was a little worried that if this book wasn't good, I would end up having to delay it till after my New Republic era books. But no, it was actually really good. I got really invested in this book, and yeah, apart from the small nitpicks I have, it's a really good book. Obviously, no, it doesn't deserve Mountain Dew. Gotta keep you guys on your toes. Never know what I'm going to do next. But yeah, if you have any interest in the EU, I would definitely recommend picking this up. It does sort of work with the new mainline canon still, but apart from basically conflicting a bit with Rogue One, such as the reason that thermal vent is there. Well, actually, it doesn't even really do that, but like, you can definitely read it as a tag along with Rogue One, although I would definitely say that it does violate, it does snap at each other quite a bit, because it still keeps the EU canon about how the Death Star plans were taken. If you played the Dark Forces video game, you would know. And the first planet that the Death Star was tested on was the prison world Despere, and not Scarif as in the movie. So, unfortunately, yeah, there is some snapping at each other with this book, but it would still fit pretty well alongside the mainline canon. And I would definitely recommend it if you are interested in the EU, or even just a general sci-fi kind of ensemble cast sort of story. But we must move on. The Death Star destroyed twice over. Emperor Palpatine betrayed by his apprentice and killed on the second Death Star before Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia Organa, and General Han Solo rise up from the ashes of what was left and decide to build the New Republic. They're going to need an ace squadron of fighters to help them enforce this New Republic's agenda. Time to reassemble Rogue Squadron. But with that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.